This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 25. A Duke Impending. Thurley was presently back in her room, but not to be dressed for tea. She was far too disturbed by what she had learned to think of anything save the necessity of seeing Alice alone at the earliest possible moment. She sat before a dressing case, but she had waved her maids away. She was staring idly at the fineries intended for the afternoon. Faishi, she knew, would be at Mrs. Ashley Duane's, and the thought of beholding the man again was revolting to all her nature. What Alice would say or do after this she could not venture to predict. Alice had hoped for the fellow's punishment before, yet felt a certain necessity for the retention of his friendship because of invaluable social connections long coveted and already firmly established through the medium he represented. But a new and shameful gravity attached to this latest development of the nobleman's nature and schemes, and continued relations with him now were fraught with highly explosive possibilities. At 5 o'clock, Alice, a trifle disturbed by Thurley's non-appearance at the Duanes', was driven home to find that the princess, overwrought and afflicted with a slight nervous headache, had gone to lie down and had readily fallen asleep. At 5:30, with the wintry darkness closing down on the avenue and all the house lights softly glowing, the third sensation scheduled for the day had its formal introduction. A messenger arrived and delivered a letter. It was addressed to Madame Van Kirk and Miss Thurley, and bore a coat of arms. The messenger waited for an answer. Alice tore the envelope apart and read as followed: "Honoured Madam and honoured Miss Thurley, may I so bold presume myself as to inform you His Excellency Karl Wilhelm Hermann, Grand Duke of Saxe-Herzenheimer, has in New York arrived, and of an audience with Miss Thurley is anxiously desiring, praying to be informed on this messenger, if he may not at your dwelling present himself in this evening by the hour of 8 o'clock and 1/2. Obediently your humble servant, Otto Wenck." "Good Lord," said Alice, "and the child asleep." But Thurley was presently very much awake. The messenger had been ushered in to wait. "To night?" said Thurley, to whom the situation had been made intelligible through 3 repetitions and a quick perusal of the note. "What in the world will happen? What shall we say?" "What can we do but face the music?" Alice answered. "We're playing a game of consequences, and the penalties must be met. Personally, I like Grand Dukes. It makes me wish that I were young and standing in your shoes. At least you'll admit, my dear, that His Excellency will be a relief from some of the others about us here. I only hope he isn't old." Thurley was suddenly jolted back to the occurrences of the afternoon. The colour crept upward toward her forehead. "Oh, I've wanted and needed you so," she said. "Alice, what do you think? Acton Gaylord has written demanding an announcement of his engagement to me, and Count Faishi's wife was here at 4 o'clock, charging me with having followed the horrid creature from Europe." Alice fairly gasped. "His wife?" "There's her card." Thurley took it from the dressing stand and placed it in Alice's half paralysed fingers. I thought at first she might stab me or something, she appeared so furiously excited. And now a Grand Duke on the scene." She tried to smile, but the situation was not altogether humorous. "Oh, well, dearie, what is the use?" said Alice, desperately resigning to anything and shrugging her shoulders with more than her customary eloquence. "If it's coming upon us in landslides, why do anything but grin and try to remain on top as long as possible. Fie, Ishi, the brute! Gaylord, the heavyweight champion! Karl Wilhelm, the lovelorn Viking, if he isn't old and doddering, as dukes have a habit of becoming. Oh, virtue, where is thy sting? My dear, we're in for it, both of us together. Let's plunge." Thurley looked at her helplessly. "We'd better see the Duke?" "See him and raise the ante," answered Alice recklessly. "The Lord only knows what may happen next. It may serve our purpose tremendously to have him on the string." "But he'll know," said Thurley, smiling, despite her doubts and vague alarms. "We have to remember that." "Why not ignore it, my dear?" Thurley made a gesture of acceptance. "And after that, what about Acton Gaylord and the Count?" "Oh, the Count. We'll grill the Count when the proper time arrives. Leave him to me." Alice rose and paced the floor in growing indignation. "He has simply got to be trussed and roasted for this," she continued. "I hope you'll do everything possible, everything that a nice, affronted girl can do, to lead him to a deadfall and let him drop it on his ghastly nerve. As for Acton, did you say he dared to write?" Thurley took the letter from a drawer and delivered it silently. Alice read it twice in half a minute. "The fool," she said. "He's trapped himself. You can do as you please with Acton after this." "I don't see exactly. It seemed to me his threat is more obvious than before. But don't you discern, dear child, that this is a written proposal for your hand, that after this he simply cannot afford to retail a story of your college widowhood and all the rest? How would it look in the light of this documentary evidence of his wish to have you for a wife, for him to say, 'She is nobody, just an ordinary pretty girl I knew in New Haven as a tutor'? Don't you see? He has spiked his own guns, placed himself quite at our mercy." Thurley looked at her steadily, while the truth of these conclusions became a little less hazy. "I never thought of that, of course. You are sure he wouldn't dare begin to tell things now?" "Acton Gaylord, with his vanity! Dear me, there's that messenger sitting downstairs all this time, and the poor Grand Duke somewhere fraying out his boots with impatience, tramping up and down. Oh, heavens, I hope he doesn't wobble. I'll write the note myself, and you can sign it with me if you wish." In her active way she swooped down at the exquisite desk that stood by the window and began at once to write. Thurley felt a recurrence of her former fever. Her heart-beat quickened. "You're going to tell him to come?" "On the run," said Alice, scribbling rapidly. "I wish I could set his clock ahead." She concluded her note in the briefest time, and, blotting it, held it up to read. "This is what I've said. His Excellency will be most cordially welcome at the home of Mrs. Van Kirk at the hour of 8:30 by Miss Thurley and Mrs. Van Kirk. Ever faithfully yours," and so forth. "Of course I get in twice to your once, my dear, but only in this note. If I had the time and the literary genius I'd write it less awkwardly. Shall I put in your love for Karl?" "Yes," said Thurley, "and a garnishment of parsley. I'm glad somebody's enjoying all the fun I'm going to have. "Dear child," said Alice, impulsively affectionate at once, "would you have hesitated to play your rôle had you known of all the things that were coming?" "Oh, this may be only the introduction," answered Thurley, in her girlish, prophetic manner, "but no matter what may come, so long as I continue to please you, keep a little of your present feeling of interest and friendship, I shall never regret it for a moment." "It's a feeling of love," said Alice, and she kissed the girl impulsively. Chapter 25